And just as a reminder, for more Microsoft webcasts, you can visit microsoft.com/webcasts. And again, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's MSDN webcast, Developing Windows SharePoint Services Workflows. And now, without any further delay, I'm going to turn the floor over to today's first presenter. We have Mike Benkovich.
Thank you, Tracy, and I want to welcome everyone to today's webcast series. We're talking about SharePoint for developers, and we're diving specifically into SharePoint and workflows. And with us today to lead the webcast is my partner in crime, Lynn Langlet. She is that SoCal dev gal who is published and doing all kinds of really cool stuff around SQL Server and SharePoint. So, and if you don't catch her, on this, she's also going to be starting a new series of webcasts called Geek Speak, which will be firing up fairly soon. So, Lynn, why don't you take it away?
Okay, great. Thanks, Mike. Well, welcome, everyone. This webcast was really driven by your requests, so thanks, and hopefully it'll be a good hour for everybody. Originally, I had intended to present an overview webcast of using SharePoint to work with web parts and workflows, but ran out of time, so created a separate webcast just for workflows. So typical format, if you're new to this, I see a lot of familiar faces, but in case you are new, is we have two MSDN presenters because of the amount of information that we're trying to get out to you in this hour. I'll be doing some conceptual overviews and some demonstrations, and we encourage you at any time to use the question queue. Mike will be managing the question queue, typing in some answers privately or posting them publicly if they're relevant to everybody, and directing some questions that you ask to me so that I can demonstrate and just answer them through the course of the presentation. So the more questions you ask, the better the presentation. So with that, we're going to go ahead and talk about prerequisites and what we're going to cover. So this session is best understood if you have a familiarity with SharePoint itself. I realize some of you might be new to this. This is actually the 13th part in a 13-part series that Mike and I have recorded on SharePoint for developers. And if this is your first time tuning in, you can actually get all the links to download the previously recorded webcasts on our blogs, which were listed in the first slide and we'll list again at the end. You will benefit from this session if you have a general familiarity with workflow concepts, not even necessarily Microsoft workflow implementation, but workflow concepts. However, I'm not assuming that you have a very deep understanding, so this is a 200-level session. We are going to look at workflow as it is implemented and used in the SharePoint environment, and we are going to have mostly demos, as I usually do, and then we're going to look at customizing workflows through the SharePoint environment. Then we're going to move to the SharePoint Designer and create workflows there, and then we'll move into Visual Studio and talk about creating workflows in Visual Studio as well as deploying workflows in Visual Studio. This is a really large topic area, and as I was preparing for this webcast and gathering resources, as I always do, which I'll post on my blog after the webcast, I found several other webcasts that are available that go into greater depth in some of these topic areas, and rather than repeat them, what I'm going to try to accomplish in this hour is to give my developers who are listening a conceptual overview with some quick demonstrations so that you can decide which tool and which environment is appropriate for your particular business scenario. For more detailed drill downs in using the tools and environments, I will have linked webcasts on my blog. Also, I've got some people that are listening today that have been communicating with me pretty extensively about some of the issues and questions that they've been having working with workflow in SharePoint, and I'll be compiling all that information and posting that up on my blog, and I really appreciate all those questions. So as we're going along, please ask questions today. If you are working in production with workflow and you have subsequent questions, it's just an area that I'm really very interested in, and I would very much want to get your emails so that I can answer your questions. So with that, we first need to understand what is a workflow and why you as developers would be interested in using our workflow technologies to implement business solutions. So conceptually, a workflow is a unit of business logic. And it's something that you had previously written using .NET code, either VB.NET, C# or something. So it's some activity flow that will run based on some input, and the input can be machine-driven or it can be user-driven. In our implementation of workflows, we have what are called activities, which are units of I'm trying not to use the word activity, but units of things that are happening. And there are also what are called cancel and fault handlers. We'll see that more formally when we get into Visual Studio. The implementation that you see in SharePoint Technologies is based on Windows Workflow Foundation, or WF. It used to be called WWF, but that acronym was taken, which is available in the .NET Framework 3.0. There are two ways from a code perspective to design workflows. Now we have visual tools that reduce the amount of code that you need to write, and that is primarily one of the reasons why you want to consider using workflows. But there's sort of two ways to create workflows. One is through something called XAML, which is very much like XAML. So here's your new acronym of the day, which XAML stands for Extensible Application Markup Language, and it kind of looks like an HTML. It's that type of a language. It's an uncompiled workflow. So it's just XAML to distinguish it from XAML, which is a presentation, or it creates a user interface type file. Or workflows can actually be written in the .NET language, which will then be compiled. So depending on which tool or which developer environment that you use will depend on what type of code is generated. And the code can be directly edited. However, you will find that using the visual tools, your need to do that should be less than would be typical if you had just written this business logic in pure .NET. And that leads really to the next slide, which is why would you want to use workflows rather than just writing the business logic as a DLL or something. In the SharePoint environment, depending on where you author the workflows can be reusable. So in other words, you can write up your business logic one time, and you can deploy it to multiple SharePoint sites, pages, libraries, so on and so forth. Now I'll tell you right off that in order to do this, you have to create your workflow in Visual Studio. You cannot do that with the workflow that you've created in the SharePoint Designer, which, if you're not familiar with the SharePoint Designer tool, it looks a lot like Front Page. We no longer have the Front Page tool. If you're doing SharePoint Designer development, we have the SharePoint Designer, and if you're doing sort of standard web design, we have Expressions Web. So those are our two tools. So another reason to use workflows is they have basically some base classes. They have a lot of common functionality that you can inherit from so that you don't have to start from scratch. Now how you inherit is sort of interesting depending on which development environment you use. One of the things that we've done, and I'm going to start by showing in a couple minutes here, is we've actually put the most common workflow scenarios right inside of the SharePoint environment and expose the properties just through basically a form so that sophisticated end users actually could do some customization, for example, assigning approvers for an approval workflow, so on and so forth, without any coding whatsoever. I mean, that's not going to be the focus, obviously, of my talk today because this is developer targeted. But like a lot of other developer topics in SharePoint, it is important that my developers understand what capability is built into the SharePoint interface itself before you go and start writing things manually. Workflows are also interesting because they're visually documented. In the two design environments, this is how it works. In the SharePoint Designer, workflows are authored through a wizard-style interface, which again allows some ability for non-programmers to be involved. And when I show you the interface, you can get a sense of just how technical a person would have to be. They have to be fairly technical, understand the concepts of like initiation variables, so on and so forth, but not having to write any sort of .NET code is sort of the idea. In Visual Studio, there is a visual designer that allows you to lay out your activities, your parts and pieces of your workflow, and then allows you to write code behind, and we'll look at that as well. They, of course, capture your business logic in an easy to look at and visualize way, and customizable by authorized users. So sort of in a nutshell, why you might want to think about using workflows is rapid development. You can capture business requirements and implement more sophisticated business logic or sophisticated business logic in a way that's faster than if you had just manually written all the .NET code. All right. How can workflows be used? There are a couple different ways, depending on where you author them. If you author them inside of SharePoint, then they're going to be associated to the particular area in SharePoint where you've authored them. And I'll be demonstrating this in just a second. So for example, if you attach a workflow and customize it to a document library, then that's where that workflow is going to live. If you use SharePoint Designer, again, you're going to have to select a particular area, a list or a library, and then the workflow that you create through SharePoint Designer will be associated with that single list or library only. One interesting aspect of workflows is that they are not required to be set to fire automatically. And what that means is you have some options right inside of SharePoint itself and the designer in terms of workflow invocation. They can be selected, or they can be automatically invoked, or a combination of both. And this is also true for Office 2007. So I'll be demonstrating this in just a second. And you can also associate multiple workflows with a single document or library. So for example, you could, in a doc library, have an approval workflow, and you could have a feedback workflow running against documents within a library. Mike, I see we've got a lot of questions piling up in the queue here. Anything that you're wanting me to address before I jump over to the demo?
Actually, we're kind of, let's see, got a couple of the you can't dial in.
Oh, okay.
There's one in here about a sign-off workflow. Can we give some real uses for that?
For a sign-off?
Like a workflow that you run when you're signing off.
An approval. Okay, yeah. What I'm going to start with in terms of my demos is I'm going to show the environment inside of SharePoint, because I'm not assuming that all of you on the call here have actually seen workflow in SharePoint. So I'm going to just do a quick demo of what it looks like from the end user experience. So I've got a site opened up here. And again, for my developers, it's important for you to understand that when you're working with SharePoint, most of you won't have a server OS on your desktop. You'll have Vista or XP or something. You're going to have to get virtual PC. Because that's it's required to have a server-based product to run SharePoint. So you can get that for free, and then that's what we've done here, and then set up a SharePoint instance. So I'm going to just open up a site, and inside that site we're going to have our doc library. And in the doc library, there are some workflows that are made available. I think there are 4 by default with the standard installation of SharePoint, and we'll look at these first once this comes up. These workflows can be selected by authorized end users to be associated with particular document libraries. And they can also be customized. One thing just to be aware of, because again I run into a lot of developers who aren't as so familiar with this. In SharePoint, all the menus are security trimmed now. So when I say authorized users, that really means authorized users. Users who are not permitted to work with workflows will not even see these menus. Okay, so I'm inside of this document library, and if I go to the document library settings, I then have the ability to work with workflow settings. And here are the 4 default workflows. Now, if you as a developer had written a custom workflow in Visual Studio and then deployed it, which we'll talk about more towards the end of the webcast, to this particular site, then those workflows would be available in this list as well. So part of the deployment of custom workflows is permissioning who will have the ability to use them and with which libraries they can be associated. So in any case, we've got these 4 to start with. Now also, if you download the Enterprise Content Management Software Development Kit, you will get some additional workflows that we've written around common scenarios. So just like a lot of other development in SharePoint, I know that as developers we're tempted to just open Visual Studio and start writing code. A common theme throughout this series, and particularly important in workflow, is for you to understand what's already been written, so that you can customize what's already there and save yourself some time. So we've got approval, feedback, signatures, and disposition approval. So we're going to just give an instance name. So we're going to call it Lynn Approve. And then we're going to customize this particular workflow. So our next choice is we need to associate a task list with this so that folks who have to make these approvals can then see that they come up, so we can have a new task list if we want, or we can use the current task list. Workflows by default keep a very detailed history of each activity, and this is the running of each activity. This is a common question that I've been getting over email. How do I, as a developer, capture this information? And again, I find that a lot of times I have to direct people back to what I'm showing you right now, because they're thinking they have to write a lot of code, and it's actually what they need is actually built in. So we've got a new workflow history list, and then here's the start options. This workflow can be started manually, and notice by an authenticated user with edit item permissions. Require manage list permissions. Start the workflow when a new item is created. Start the workflow when an item is changed. So I'm going to say when an item is created, and I'm going to leave this start manually just because I want to demonstrate something else in a minute. Then we're going to say next. And then we're going to have to say who can approve. Now, there are significant restrictions on these pre-built workflows, and that obviously is why I'm sure some of you are on the call, because maybe you've looked at this already. So who the tasks can be assigned to, all or one. They can be reassigned or requesting changes. And I'm just going to put an administrator just for the purposes of time here. This, of course, is querying the Active Directory because we've got the default Windows authentication. And then we're just going to say approve, please. And then we can specify a due date if we want to. And we can also say, give them 1 day or 2 days. And then when the workflow is completed, then cancel the workflow when the document is rejected or when the document is changed. And then once the workflow has been completed, update the approval status. We'll do that. And we'll say OK. So now we've associated this particular instance of this workflow with this document library. And you can see here's the name, and we're inside of the document library. So if we create a new document, and the interaction with Office does require Office 2007, and we type something, and we save it. Being shared into the document, saved into the shared document library. And we close, and we update. We can see that we have a new property available on the document library, that the workflow is in progress. And if we click on it, we can take a look and see that here's our history, and here are our tasks. So if we click here, what we get is an ASPX form that is automatically created. And this is one of the critical differences between developing workflows either from SharePoint itself or from the SharePoint Designer. When you're working with SharePoint itself or the Designer, then these forms are automatically generated, and they're ASP.NET forms. If you're working in Visual Studio, then you can either use ASP.NET forms, or you can associate InfoPath forms that you can build and customize. So if you're needing more customized level of interaction with the workflow, so that might be like initiation, it might be like additional information, so on and so forth, then you're going to have to move to Visual Studio. And I'm going to say I approve. And note that I can reassign this, or I could request a change, and then I'm going to approve it. And you can see there it's approved. And if I go back to the documents, I have the approved status. Okay? Now, and I think that the workflow is complete, so I'm not sure I'm going to be able to show this much in here. So do note at the top of the Word viewer here, it notes that it's a server document, and I need to edit the document if I wanted to. There we go. And yeah, this shows the workflow integration with Office itself. So you can see that we've got the workflows that are by default available within SharePoint. Okay? Which, by the way, if you don't want the end users to see these, you can turn these off at the level of the server. It's called deactivating a feature, and then there we've got the particular workflow that I set up. So that kind of shows the interaction there. Okay, Mike, how are we doing on questions?
We've got a few questions in here.
Okay, well, let's pop back to the slides and let's talk about those before I go on.
We had a question about, is there a way, aside from coding API calls, to track down the workflows that are available for particular implementation, and also to get to their feature GUID?
Okay. So if I understand the question, it's the developer wants to know, I've got a SharePoint site and I want to know what workflows have been enabled. You could do it programmatically, you could call web service, but probably an easier way to do it is just actually look at, see what's been activated, and I'll demo that in just a minute. To get the GUIDs, you have to call the web service. Okay, so I'll actually demo it right now.
Right.
I'll just pop over there, and because I did open up the administration. This is the administration site for this particular instance. And if I go into application management and bring it up, there's a section in here. And again, if you're not familiar, if you're kind of, again, I'm maybe assuming that a lot of you guys have been on some of these other webcasts or just know, so please ask if not. This is a separate website that comes with SharePoint that is for the purpose of setting up administration through a GUI interface. Now all this stuff is exposed as web services as well, so you can always do it programmatically. But at the application management level, if you go into workflow settings, globally, you can either enable user-defined workflows for the entire site, yes or no, alert internal users who do not have site access when they're assigned a workflow task. Now, I didn't bother setting this up, but workflow notifications can be flowed through to Outlook, which is, obviously a really, really common scenario. The webcasts that I'm going to link to after this one show that pretty extensively, so that's where that comes from. Allow external users to participate in workflow by sending them a copy of the document, yes or no. So there's that, and then there is on the shared services. No, there's not. You have to actually go back into the site itself, and at the top level of the site, if you go to Site Settings, and you go to Modify All Site Settings, I believe, and there's some place here where you show which features, and I may not remember where it is exactly. Site Collection Features. Oh, I think I might have got lucky there. There we go. So site collection features, and here you can see if you wanted to turn off, for example, globally, the workflows that came with SharePoint and just replace them with your own, you could activate or deactivate. So it's just one way to do it from there. Okay? Other questions, Mike, before I jump back?
Well, one of them has to do with when you create a workflow in Visual Studio, how do they appear in the shared documents, or how can you get to?
Right, how do you get there? Okay,
yeah.
I'll be getting to that.
You're going to be getting to that.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so that was kind of a little overview of how workflows are implemented in SharePoint. Now we're going to look at, from a developer standpoint, how you can write custom workflows going beyond the SharePoint interface. So the first place that you're going to want to look is SharePoint Designer, which comes with the Office Suite. And like I had said, before you just start from scratch, you might want to grab the Enterprise Content Management SDK and get the sample workflows in there, or you can customize from within, or you can work within the designer itself. Now, one thing I want to be clear on here, you cannot, because I probably wouldn't have put this bullet in thinking about this a little more, you cannot take a workflow that you write in Visual Studio and open it in SharePoint Designer. And the reason is the workflows are written differently. In Visual Studio, they're written in code behind, in basically .NET. It has to be compiled. And in SharePoint Designer, they're written in XAML. And we'll be seeing that in just a minute. So it's sort of a linear progression. Start with the SharePoint environment. You can open those workflows in the SharePoint Designer, work on them in the SharePoint Designer. If you want to, you can take a XAML workflow and put it into Visual Studio, but you can't go the other way. Okay, so hopefully that's making sense.
But couldn't you create a XAML workflow in Visual Studio?
Yes, yeah, you could
So,
if you want.
but the point is that the code behind, which is what Visual Studio does,
Right.
if it's got the code behind it, it's got to be open in Visual Studio.
Right, exactly. So it's usually a linear progression. So, okay. Other very important considerations for you when you're trying to figure out which design environment or development environment to use is you're going to see SharePoint Designer is super fast. I mean, you can create a workflow in 10 minutes, which is great. It has great value, but there are significant limitations. And as I had said, the workflow that you create in the SharePoint Designer is associated to one list or library only. You cannot package it as a feature, or they call it a SharePoint template. Kind of the terms are used interchangeably. And basically what that means is a feature or a SharePoint package, I guess is the exact term, is something that can be deployed to multiple locations. You cannot do that when you develop in SharePoint Designer. Also, in the Windows Workflow Foundation, there are actually two types of workflows. There are what are called sequential workflows, and then something called state machine workflows. Now, just to give you like the 50,000 feet view of what those two types of workflows are, sequential workflows are when the process is known and you have step A to step B to step C. You can have, of course, some branching, some if-then branching and all that. State machine workflows are used frequently when there is not a sort of regular progression. And an example of a state machine is pizza delivery, pizza preparation, or food preparation, where probably actually restaurant food, where you have a complicated menu and perhaps it's not linear. Perhaps somebody sends their steak back because they don't like it, or perhaps they change their mind about some food item. So the order will have a state. So on appetizer served, after appetizer served, on entree served, so on and so forth. Think of the word on and after. Fully going into sequential and state machine workflows is really beyond the scope of this webcast, and I can post some resources about it, and I will. Suffice it to say that in Designer, only sequential, or if A, then B, and C type workflows are supported. State machine workflows are, of course, supported in Visual Studio. So that is a design consideration. More limitations. The core functionality of a workflow is this object called an activity. And you can almost think of it as a class. It's a little unit of having something done, basically. And custom activities are not supported in the SharePoint Designer. Also, debugging is not supported. But of course, you're not writing any .NET code, so that's maybe not really important. But if you're writing anything complicated, you generally want a debugger. Another consideration that I think is actually more important is, and I mentioned this earlier, that input forms are limited in the Designer to ASP.NET. You cannot do really any customization. If you want to create a custom form using InfoPath, then you're going to have to use Visual Studio. And then, as I said, there's XAML, no code behind. And okay, we've talked about that, so it's time to take a look. So let's go over and take a look at how this works. So I have opened up the Designer, SharePoint Designer, and I need to open up the right site though. So let me go back, and so I don't really want to be working in the admin site. So I want to work in my regular site. So let me get the URL there, copy that guy, and open this up. And there we go. Okay, so inside of the Designer, we have the ability to visually design, as you would guess, and there's strong support for tooling and CSS and all kinds of other cool stuff, and we've done this in a lot of other webcasts, but again, I don't want to assume that everybody's already seen it. In addition, once this opens up, there is a really interesting tool. It's called a wizard, but it's really more of a tool to help you get up and going with your workflows really quickly. Once this thing wakes up here, just want to show you what a page looks like. Now, as mentioned, when there's just showing a page. Oh, one thing I didn't mention, and I always try to when I talk about SharePoint, because again, some of you, this might be the first webcast for you. This version of SharePoint is 100% ASP.NET 2.0 compatible, and that's just very, very, very important. It's not so important for workflows per se, but it's very important in general in working with it. You might have noticed while the page was loading that it said master page, because master pages are supported, ASP.NET controls are supported, and really everything in ASP.NET is supported because SharePoint is a type of an ASP.NET website. So anyway, that's not really our world though. What our world is today is we're going to create a new workflow. So to do that, got to grab some information from the server, and then we'll get this wizard tool. While this is cooking, Mike, any questions?
Not too much.
I'm surprised with the large number of people that we have.
Yeah.
Everybody's in holiday mood, huh?
Mm-hmm.
All right, okay. So here we are. We're in the Workflow Designer, and we need to give a name to our workflow. So I'm going to call this Lynn Test. And this is the key point right here. Which SharePoint list should this workflow be attached to? Now notice we don't have much to pick from here because of where we're at. So one of the steps that you would normally do is you would create a list or a library in a particular site that you wanted to associate this workflow with. So you go to your site and you would create before you started. So do as I say rather than what I do, right? So I'm going to go ahead and create a new announcements list real quick like here. And I'll just call it A and say create. And if you're not familiar with lists and libraries, lists are basically kind of like spreadsheets. In this case we have a title and we have a modified. And libraries are viewers of metadata about documents. So we've got this list called A, and I don't think this thing will refresh, but sort of go with me here. We could have just associated it to that. Here's our initiation choices. Allow the workflow to be manually started from an item, automatically start the workflow when a new item is created, or automatically start the workflow whenever an item is changed. Okay? Now notice we have two boxes to address. First we have initiation, and this is going to create that ASP.NET form for us. So use the workflow parameters to collect data from participants when they start a workflow. If the workflow is set to automatic, default values will be used instead. So it's pretty self-explanatory. So I'm going to put in city and say single line of text and default value. Let's see, Irvine. It's kind of close to where I live. Say there and say OK. And we also could put in variables if we wanted to. And I'll just say, I don't know, number A or whatever it might be, and then just put in number and say OK, and there we go. So we've got those initiation values and those variables that we can work with in our workflow if we wish to. So really just from a planning point, create your list or your location first and think about what information needs to be gathered. And what would be some business examples of that? Oh, you might want to get some kind of metadata when you're kicking off maybe an approval workflow. You need to say what business group the person is associated with, if that information couldn't be pulled out of Active Directory, so on and so forth. So then you say next, and you're kind of in the heat of this thing. And basically you're in the step designer. So you name your steps, and then you have conditions and actions. Okay? So this is sort of a wrapper around the concept of an activity, if you will. Now the items that are available on the conditions and actions lists are subsets of what is available in Windows Workflow. And it's just that we've taken the most common business scenarios and we've put them inside of here. And in fact, I heard in one webcast it's actually possible to extend this by installing custom activities into your SharePoint server. It just seemed a little bit complicated to me though, so I didn't want to spend a lot of time on it. I'd rather work in Visual Studio for that. So in any case, so what do you have to pick from here? You can compare form template fields, compare data sources, look for a keyword in a field, look for modified in a specific date span, modified by a person, created in a date span, created by a specific person, specific file type. So let's just say created by a specific person. And then, just really simple to work with. You can see that we've got, you can delete the condition, work in here, and we have people to pick from, user from the address book, workflow lookup. If we added that, then we're going to look it up from, we could say the workflow data, and well, I didn't put it in there, or the form template, but just to kind of show you what the options are. And then we could say, where is it created by? I think it's in here somewhere. Well, there's a modified by, but you kind of get the idea. It's not making logical sense, but you get the idea. So look up the information from the modified by and fill it in. Notice also you can find in the field information, and we have this little function which again allows us to look up. The point that I'm trying to show you here is it's designed for no-code programming so that you can retrieve values and associate them into your workflow. But you have to have some degree of understanding of workflows and business logic creation. So my experience with this, because I actually used it in beta with a lot of customers, was that even pretty seasoned subject matter experts needed some help. What I thought was kind of interesting use of this, and this is something I actually did in production, was I would sit with a subject matter expert, and instead of them making a Visio diagram or a PowerPoint or writing down the requirements or something, I could translate what they were saying into a starter workflow using this workflow designer, because I could sort of translate it into an if-then language. And then when we were done, let me just kind of get out of here and say, I'll just pick administrator just to have something here. So if created by the administrator, then assign a to-do item to X, Y, and Z user. And you can see it's written in plain English. So what I found that this thing would do is it could help me to clarify the business requirements, because one of the challenges I had found in writing workflow type applications, especially where there weren't defined processes, and a lot of customers that I had as a consultant before I joined Microsoft, this was the first time that they were automating this stuff. So it was kind of ad hoc before. Once we got into it, there was this constant changing of what the actual process could be, which just delays the project, and it was just very frustrating. And I found that this tool could help me get to agreement more quickly with the subject matter experts, because it was like a translation tool basically. So anyway, so I'm adding a task. So this action will add a to-do item to the task list, and we say next, and whatever, new task, and I'll just say new task 1, whatever it is, ABC, and finish. And then we're going to say to which users, and I'll add it to whoever this poor guy is. He's going to get all of them, and so on and so forth. So I'd say, if this item on the list was created by the admin, then give Dave a new task. It could be to approve it or something. And then you can put in else if. So we can say, if it was created by a specific person, so we can say if it was created by Jesse, then we want to do something else. So what else could we do? We could send an email, we could collect data, we could assign a form, set a field, we could update the list item, and we can actually go in here and look at more actions. And I know it might seem tedious that I'm actually reading these to you, but one of the things that I have found in questions and emails I get from developers is they're talking again about how to write these things in Visual Studio, and they're already available inside of SharePoint Designer, and it's just so much faster to do it this way. So, I don't know, log to history list or something. Okay, log this message to the history list, and we can go out and say, this is it, and if we wanted to, we could customize that. And then you can add additional steps. Now, one of the things that's nice in here too is there's actually a check, which will tell you if you've made some logical errors. So if you do just hand this over to a sort of a non-technical person and they try to use it, it can help them. And then when you're done, you just click Finish. And notice it's saving the XAML. And if you look over here, you can see it's creating the workflow, creating the forms. And it's really a no-code workflow. It's, super fast. And what I have found is for, probably about 50% of the cases, I could actually use the inside of SharePoint or the SharePoint design or customization to make the users really quite happy. And then once you take a look at this over here, you can see we've got the workflow. There's the ASPX page. Interestingly, if we double-click the XAML, see what happens? The workflow designer comes back up. So it's really, I'm pretty happy with the way this thing works. And you'll see there's rules, there's the configuration, and then there's these ASPX pages. If you wanted to click on them, you could take a look at that and see. So that's kind of the experience. And you can see inside there's the page. And see there's how the page has actually been rendered for you. So you can customize this page somewhat, but you can't interact with InfoPath, which is the limitation here. So that's the SharePoint designer experience with workflows. And I guess my big message to all of you listening is you might poo-poo it and say, well, hey, I write code and I don't work in those silly designer tools. For this case, you might want to take a look because it can save you quite a bit of time in some scenarios. So I'm going to pop back now, and I'm going to move into Visual Studio because this, of course, would be a developer presentation, and we got to go there too. So, Mike, how's questions looking?
We're pretty good.
Wow, I think everybody's in holiday mood.
I think so.
Yeah, I know I am too. I don't know if you guys out there listening had the same thing, but I was telling Mike and some of the other people on the webcast, I was sending lots of mail this week and just getting back. I'm on vacation. So I guess we're just the hard workers. Okay, so we want to move into Visual Studio. What do we need to do? First thing is we need to set up our development environment. Just plug it in, turn it on. Like I said, when you're working with SharePoint, you got to have Windows Server 2003. So you'll be working with IIS 6. You'll be running Virtual PC, which we let you download for free. And then you're going to want the SDK, and also it looks like I forgot to put it on there. There's 3 SDKs, okay? There's 3 SDKs and something else. So you want the SharePoint Server Services SDK. You want the Windows SharePoint Services SDK. You want the SharePoint Server SDK. You want the Enterprise Content Management SDK, and then you want the Windows Workflow extensions in the .NET Framework 3.0. So it takes a little bit of time to set all this up. If you're not inclined to want to do that, if you want to just sort of play around with it, something I would recommend to you is you can go to MSDN Virtual Labs, and we have all this set up. The restriction, though, is it's only yours for 90 minutes, and then we reset the virtual PC. But if you just want to kind of play and not really ready to set up the whole dev environment, go over to MSDN Virtual Labs. And just to let you know, we feel your pain on development environment setup, and we've been communicating up how it would be really wonderful if we had an easier way to develop in the SharePoint environment. But we don't, so that's the way it goes. So .NET Framework 3.0. You need the Visual Studio 2005 tools for Microsoft Office System version 2. You need the workflow extensions. All this stuff here, okay? You need all this stuff, and I've put this on my blog. I'm not going to read the whole slide to you. It does take, honestly, about 3-4 hours to get your environment set up. So once it is set up, though, then what do you get? You get templates, and we're going to take a look at those in just a couple minutes. And they're specific for SharePoint workflows, and you can create SharePoint sequence or state machine workflows. You can also create custom activities, and you get that with the workflow extensions, and you can then use those activities in the activity library. A person who, and I'll put this link on my blog, I actually met him last week. His name's John Flanders, and he's an MVP for workflow. He has done a series of outstanding presentations on how sort of the philosophy behind creating custom activities for Windows workflow. So if you really are a very, have advanced scenarios and you're going to have to do all your development inside of Visual Studio, just sort of an aside on best practices for workflow in general, one of the things that I have seen frequently is a lack of understanding about using workflow properly. And John has some great best practices. So John Flanders, I'll put a link to his blog up on my blog, particularly around how best practices for creating activities that I think some of you could benefit from. Okay, so I had mentioned this earlier, state machine versus sequential. When do I use which one? Sequential is a known one-way flow, A then B, then C, so on and so forth. Interestingly, state machine, and I use the restaurant example, is there's looping back possible. So meal is ordered, meal is cooked, meal is sent back, so on and so forth. State machine is often used for longer running with more human interaction, and that sounds like SharePoint in a lot of cases. So as some of you become more comfortable with workflows, I think that you will actually move over to Visual Studio because of state machine. Because of course you might be reminded you can't create that in the SharePoint Designer. Okay, so mentioned that workflows in Visual Studio are code behind, sequential or state machine. You can have workflow modifications, you can have activities, you can have debugging, and they are created as templates, so you can bind them anywhere. We'll talk briefly about deployment. You can use any form type, and they're packaged as a feature. And with that, as I'm going over, Mike, I see there's a couple questions. Anything that I should be answering right now?
Well, let's see. There's a question here about ECM and SharePoint SDKs. Are they combined in a single package? So that in other words, when you get the SDK for SharePoint, are you getting ECM also?
You know what I found? Because I actually looked at that, because it said that on the Download Center, and I didn't find that to be true. So I would say that you want to get both of them.
Okay.
So yeah, I'm going to pass that. I need to send that up to the SharePoint team. I'm going to pass that feedback up to the SharePoint team because they're really pretty responsive. But I think they're just really trying to get samples out so quickly that they're just putting out the new stuff and they're not maybe thinking about integrating it. All right, so here we are in Visual Studio, and we are going to create a new project. We've installed all the goodness that we needed so that we could have these options available. And the project is going to be of type SharePoint Sequential Workflow Library. So you see over here, under our language, we have the SharePoint extensions, and we have to have the workflow extensions as well. And we have SharePoint Sequential and SharePoint State Machine. So you got to pick the right type first, basically. So we're going to say sequential and open that guy up. And that's going to build us out a template with a number of files that are going to help us to get started. Now also, when we installed the SDKs, we had some extensions that are added to our toolbox in Visual Studio, and they give us more tools to work with, and I'll show you what those are. They're basically activities that are specific to SharePoint. So inside of here, we've got some references to the SharePoint namespaces, so Microsoft SharePoint and Microsoft Office Workflow Tasks and Microsoft SharePoint Workflow Actions. Notice also this is for the core workflow. And we have a folder that deals with deployment that we'll come back to. And you can see that we have Workflow 1 CS and Workflow 1 Designer CS. So we'll open up Workflow 1, and we'll see a visual design surface that will start with an activity. Each one of these squares is an activity that's required for a SharePoint workflow. So this is sort of finally the familiar world that I'm assuming most of you already work in every day. And you can see over here we've got properties that we can associate with our particular workflow. Now, in addition to the Windows workflow tasks, or I should say activities more correctly, we also have activities that are specific to SharePoint. So you can see we have a workflow section and we have a workflow task section. So let's take a look at these first, because again, you need to know what tools are available so that you can kind of know where to start. These are really common sort of business logic type activities. Sort of like a simple one would be like an if-else. And you can see when I drag it on, if you've got really good eyes, you can see the little tiny green crosses are showing me where I could put this if-else activity. And then this will expand out. And once this expands out, then I can associate additional activities inside of this branch. And the designer is an intelligent designer. When there are required properties that are not configured, you get this little red spot. And this is not specific to SharePoint. This is Windows workflow in general. But again, I don't want to assume that everybody has seen it. Then if you want to fix that error, you just go over to your property conditions not set, and then you have to say, what is going to cause this if-else triggering? Is it going to be code, or is it going to be a declarative rule? So that's kind of more workflow, formal workflow stuff than specific to SharePoint, so I don't know how much time I'm going to spend on that. A couple other things I'll show you here. What I was talking about earlier in terms of you guys finding out about best practices, a really common thing that I see with developers who are new to workflow, because it's sort of a new design paradigm, is rather than using specific activities, and there really are only a base set, and I guess I'll actually move over to the SharePoint. And you can see they relate to tasks. So on task created, I'll just create a task. Okay, so if a certain condition, then we want to create a task. Otherwise, I don't know, maybe we want to create a different task or something. Put it over here. And these are very specific to SharePoint, these particular activities. And these encapsulate code, which I'm actually going to show you in just a minute. But what I've commonly found in actually this product and other products with developers who are new to it is workflows that look like this. And I'm over-exaggerating here to make a point. But if you're going to do that in a workflow, you might as well not use workflow. Because really what you're doing is this is just simply code. And here I have to set what's called the execute code property. And I'll just say do something. And then we'll crack open the code. So you're not really accomplishing anything there. So you can see you're just basically, it's basically a method. So it's a wrapper for a method. So what I'm saying is sort of a core best practice is first understand all the activities that you have. And then second, understand all the SharePoint activities. Think about the business problems you're trying to solve. And then frankly, you're probably going to have to write some custom activities. And I think John Flanders' webcasts and presentations, I don't know if he's written a book yet or not, I think he's going to, are really the best source of information that I've seen on how to write activities. Because if we drill in here, we actually have to set what's called a correlation token, and that allows information to be passed between activities in a workflow. So we're just going to actually set it to the workflow itself. And again, same thing here. And over here, we need to set the property condition. If we set a code condition, then we say is something. And here. And then that's going to allow us to write code inside of there. So I'm wanting you guys to see the relationship between the designer and the coding. Again, conceptually, the idea here is that you have a better visibility into your business logic so that you can, it's more extensible, it's more maintainable, it's more reusable. Of course, you can also debug. Because the question was asked, let me just show you quickly the deployment files. What comes with the template are a batch file, which is pretty well documented. Let's see here. And this tells you what needs to be done so that this workflow, once you complete it, can be deployed to the particular SharePoint server. So that answers the question that was asked a long time ago. Basically, you need 2 XML metadata files, feature XML and workflow XML. And then you're going to do a build. And then you're going to eventually here run STS ADM to install it, and then you're going to do an IIS reset. That's a really, really high-level sort of idea. And you can see we've got feature XML, and these are just shell files. There's really not much in them. In fact, I have a link out. I'm going to post out to a website that has sample metadata on feature XML and workflow XML, just so that you can make it a little bit, it's a little bit easier for you, so you don't have to manually put it in here. Okay, so I'm going to go back over here and look at the workflow itself. Okay. Mike, how are we doing on questions? Because I know we're getting slim on time here, and I want to make sure that we're answering questions.
We're doing all right. We had a couple of questions on running SharePoint on top of small business server that I'm answering, but there was a question about in the SharePoint Designer allowing us to put text blobs or rich text markup into documents when we're working with them.
Yeah, see, again, that's when you're going to move into the designing workflows in Visual Studio, because you're going to need a custom info path form for that. I would think you'd want that anyway, and because it's much easier to allow that, because info path has the ability to accept rich text, just by dragging a rich text box on. So I would think you'd want to do that. One point I want to make, because I'm not going to have time to show the integration between info path and the workflow, and that's a really, really important aspect of this, is I'm linking out to a presentation from Eileen Howe, who does a 1-hour demo on basically that, building it out. So if you're, at the end of this, if you're saying, okay, good, I see what I can do in native SharePoint, I can see what I can do in the Designer, but I really need to work in Visual Studio because of my business needs, then the next thing that you're going to want to do is take a look at Eileen's presentation, because she shows pretty extensively how that's done. So let me pop back and...
Hey, one other question that's
Sure.
in here. In Visual Studio, when you're working with the code behind, on where you can find documentation on what the sender and event args are for each type of activity. In other words, where can you find that documentation?
It's pretty well documented in MSDN documentation, but also in the SharePoint SDK. Now, it's not perfectly documented, as I know some of my listeners will attest to. You know who you are, but it's pretty well documented. If you find something that's seriously lacking, send Mike or myself a mail. I mean, we are working with the team to try to correct some of the documentation deficiencies, and there have been some cases where the documentation is less than stellar. So please do that. So kind of talking about the deployment quickly while we're finishing here. Deploying in Visual Studio allows you to associate your workflow with any particular number of sites or lists. So let's see, I wanted to just pop up here. So you create the workflow, deploy, and then, set the permissions. And just a quick slide on features in general, working with features. All right, well, I feel like I talked nonstop again for an entire hour, and I feel like I just scratched the surface of this topic. There is much, much more that can be known about it. But hopefully what I've done, my goal has been to give you an idea of which tool is right for the job and what sort of progression you need to take as a developer to get started and to understand how to work with Windows workflows in SharePoint. We probably will have subsequent questions. I know I'm going to have lots of information to put up on my blog, so be sure and check it out, blogs.msdn.com/SoCalDevGal, and Mike has got Benko tips. And Mike, I understand you're migrating your blog over to 100% WSS.
I'm in the process of that. In fact, I'm going to be posting a number of blog postings that talk through doing that, and possibly even creating some HDI or how do I short video snippets that we'll also be posting up there.
That's great.
So,
well, as Mike mentioned, I've got a new series starting in webcasts, and it's also going to be available on Channel 9. It starts next week, July 11th, and I'll be working with my fellow presenter, Glenn Gordon. The series is called Geek Speak, and it's developer-to-developer talk. We've got our July lineup posted on both Channel 9 and the Geek Speak blog, which is blogs.msdn.com/geekspeak. And I've got guests for August and September. It is developer to developer. One other thing I want to throw out there to all my audience is if you got something that you've done that you're particularly proud of that's pretty cutting edge, send me a mail. Maybe I'll have you on as a guest. So with that, I think I'm actually over time, so guess I'm done for today. I got to turn it back over to Tracy.
Excellent. Thanks, Lynn. I do want to remind everybody that for more information, you can print a PDF of today's session. To do that, just go to the File menu in your upper navigation bar. Now, please feel free to continue to submit your questions into the Q&A panel. This is just found at the bottom of your live meeting screen, and you want to hit that Ask button. And also, I'm going to be posting a survey here in just a minute. If you would all please take a moment to fill that out before you log off. We do appreciate your feedback. Also, as a reminder, for upcoming and previously recorded webcasts, you'll want to visit Microsoft.com/webcast. You can go here to access this webcast, which should be available for download in about 24 hours. Now, if you have any webcast content ideas, something out there that you would like to see and you haven't yet, we'd love to hear from you. Just take note of this link here. And for anybody who's interested in receiving a free 14-day trial of Microsoft Office Live Meeting, you'll want to visit Microsoft.com/presentlive. And here's the survey from our session today. Please follow the links provided to complete today's webcast evaluation. And with that, I do want to extend a very special thank you to both Mike and Lynn for your presentation today and answering the great questions that we had come through the queue. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to conclude today's session. The audience may now disconnect from the audio portion of today's presentation.